In the final days of the American Civil War, when the cannons fell silent and the South realized it had lost, something far more valuable than armies quietly disappeared. Not a document. Not a general. Not a flag. Gold. Tons of it, in coins, bars, and foreign currency, gathered during 4 years of war, sacrifice, and desperation. History records the surrender of the Confederate armies. History records the fall of Richmond. But history does not record what happened to the Confederate treasure. And that silence is where this story begins. Before we go any further, if you're drawn to real historical mysteries, lost treasures, and stories buried beneath the surface of America's past, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These stories are still out there, waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss the next one. Now, imagine this. April 1865. The Confederacy is dying. Its leaders are fleeing. Its cities are burning. Its future is collapsing with every passing hour. And somewhere on a dark southern road, a small convoy of wagons is moving quietly through the night.
No banners.
No music. Only the sound of wheels turning and men who know that if they fail, history will erase them. Inside those wagons is not just money. It is hope. It is revenge. It is the belief that one day, the South might rise again. But that convoy will never reach its destination. The wagons vanish. The men scatter. And the treasure, worth millions even by today's standards, is never officially recovered. Some say it was buried in the earth, hidden beneath trees that still stand today. Others believe it was sunk into a river, swallowed by mud and time. And a few insist the truth is far darker, that men were killed to protect the secret. For more than 150 years, Americans have searched for this lost fortune. And they are still searching. Tonight, you're going to hear the full story, step by step, of how an entire nation's treasure disappeared without a trace, and why it may still be out there, waiting to be found. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate States of America were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival. Union armies were advancing from every direction. Railroads lay in ruins. Cities that once symbolized Southern pride were now filled with smoke, refugees, and fear. The war that had begun with bold speeches and waving flags was ending in exhaustion and collapse. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was the final symbol holding everything together. And then Richmond fell. On April 2nd, 1865, Confederate leaders abandoned the city. Government buildings were evacuated. Warehouses were burned. Papers were destroyed. Anything that could not be carried was left behind to the enemy. By the time Union troops entered Richmond, the heart of the Confederacy was already gone. President Jefferson Davis fled south. Cabinet members scattered. Generals surrendered or disappeared into the countryside. But while the world focused on the fall of armies and governments, another question haunted the fleeing officials, one that could not be answered publicly. What happens to the money? The Confederacy had financed an entire war. Soldiers had been paid. Weapons purchased. Foreign suppliers bribed. Gold and silver had flowed in through secret ports and dangerous blockade runs. That wealth did not vanish just because the war was lost. And surrendering it was never a simple option. Handing over the treasure would mean total defeat, not just militarily, but symbolically. It would mean accepting that the Confederate cause was dead forever. Many of the men fleeing Richmond were not ready to accept that. They believed the war was lost, but the idea of the South was not. If the treasure could be saved, hidden, or preserved, then perhaps one day it could fund a return, a rebellion, a revival, or at the very least, prevent it from falling into Union hands. As the Confederate government fractured, decisions were made quickly and in secrecy. There was no time for debate. Union cavalry was already closing in. The gold had to move, and it had to move immediately. So while armies surrendered in daylight, the most important operation of the Confederacy began quietly, in the shadows, far from the eyes of history. The Confederate treasure was not a single chest filled with gold. It was something far more complex and far more dangerous to lose. From the very beginning of the war, the Confederacy understood one brutal truth. Ideals alone could not win battles. Armies needed food. Weapons needed to be bought. Foreign governments needed to be convinced, or bribed, to look the other way. And all of that required money. Despite its struggling economy, the Confederacy managed to accumulate significant wealth through multiple sources. Taxes were collected from southern states. Union funds were seized when territories changed hands. Cotton, King Cotton, as they called it, was traded abroad for gold and silver, often through risky blockade-running operations along the coast. Foreign currency entered Confederate vaults, British sovereigns, French francs, Mexican silver dollars, anything that could hold value beyond the collapsing Confederate dollar. Gold coins minted in the United States before the war were especially prized. They were universally trusted, easily spent, easily hidden. By 1865, this treasure was scattered across several locations, constantly moved to stay ahead of Union forces. It was never allowed to sit still for long. Each movement increased the risk, but also the secrecy. What made the treasure even more sensitive was not just its value, but its symbolism. This gold represented sacrifice. It represented loyalty. And for some, it represented unfinished business. If captured by the Union, it would be displayed as proof that the Confederate cause was not only defeated, but stripped bare. If surrendered, it would erase any possibility of resistance, even in memory. That is why, as the end approached, Confederate leaders treated the treasure almost like a living thing, something that needed protection at all costs. It was packed carefully, counted and recounted. Guards were chosen not just for skill, but for loyalty. Some historians believe written records were deliberately destroyed so that no single document could reveal the full truth, because whoever controlled the treasure controlled the final chapter of the Confederacy. And that chapter had not yet been written. As the Confederate government unraveled, decisions were no longer made in grand halls or recorded in official minutes. They were made in whispers, in borrowed rooms, behind locked doors, often late at night. Union troops were closing in faster than expected. Telegraph lines were unreliable. Roads were clogged with refugees, deserters, and retreating soldiers. Trust, once the backbone of command, was beginning to fracture. And in the middle of that chaos sat the treasure. Some officials argued it should be surrendered. They feared that keeping it would only bring more bloodshed. Others believed hiding it would be pointless, that the Confederacy was finished and no gold could change that. But a smaller, more determined group disagreed. They believed the war was lost, but the cause was not. To them, the treasure was not just money. It was leverage, insurance, a seed that could one day grow into something new, or at least keep the dream alive in exile. The decision was made quickly and without public record. The treasure would be moved, quietly, secretly, and if necessary, permanently hidden. Only a handful of men would know the full plan. Each would be given just enough information to carry out his part, but not enough to betray the whole operation if captured. This was not paranoia. Union officers had already begun interrogating captured Confederates, offering leniency in exchange for information. The fewer people who knew the truth, the safer the treasure would be. Routes were discussed and rejected. Major roads were too dangerous. Rail lines were destroyed or monitored. The convoy would have to blend into the chaos of the collapsing South. No uniforms, no markings, no written orders, just wagons, armed escorts, and men who understood the weight of what they were carrying. Once the decision was made, there was no turning back. If the treasure survived the journey, it might one day rewrite history. If it didn't, then it would become a legend. The convoy did not look impressive. There were no banners, no polished uniforms, no sign that these wagons carried the financial heart of a fallen nation. To an outsider, it could have passed for just another group of refugees fleeing south. But inside the wagons were heavy wooden chests reinforced with iron bands, canvas sacks sewn thick to prevent tearing. The kind of cargo that forced men to lift carefully and walk slowly. Every step mattered. The guards were chosen deliberately. Not the loudest, not the bravest, but the most reliable. Men who had already lost brothers, homes, and futures to the war. Men who understood that betrayal now would serve no one. They traveled mostly at night. During the day, the wagons were hidden in tree lines, abandoned barns, or behind rolling hills. Fires were kept small. Voices were kept low. Even among themselves, the men spoke little about what they were carrying. Because words have a way of escaping. The roads were dangerous. Union patrols were everywhere. Bands of deserters roamed the countryside. Desperation had turned former neighbors into thieves. A wagon loaded with food might draw attention. A wagon loaded with gold would invite disaster. Every sound became a threat. The crack of a branch. The distant echo of hoofbeats. A lantern light on the horizon. More than once, the convoy stopped abruptly, waiting in silence while riders passed nearby. Hands rested on rifle stocks. Breaths were held. No one wanted to be the man who gave them away. As the days passed, tension grew. Some guards began to ask questions. Others worried that the plan was already compromised. Rumors traveled faster than wagons ever could, and someone, somewhere, always seemed to know more than they should. Still, the convoy moved on, because turning back was no longer an option. And somewhere ahead, the fate of the Confederate treasure waited, whether as salvation or as a grave. Years later, long after the war had ended, people across the South would tell remarkably similar stories. They spoke of wagons that moved at odd hours, of armed men who paid in gold instead of paper, of strangers who asked too many questions and answered none. At the time, these details meant little. The countryside was flooded with soldiers, refugees, and deserters. Chaos had become normal. But in hindsight, the stories began to line up. An innkeeper in South Carolina later recalled a group of exhausted men who arrived just before dawn. They refused food, drank only water, and paid for shelter with a single gold coin, far more than the cost of the room. A farmer in Georgia claimed he saw wagons stopped deep in the woods, guarded as if they carried something precious. When he approached, a rifle was raised, not fired, but raised, and he understood the message immediately. In another account, a woman remembered hearing metal being unloaded late at night near her family's land. Not crates of food, not barrels, but something heavier, something that clinked when it moved. None of these people understood what they had seen at the time. They only knew it felt wrong. Union patrols also picked up fragments of the same rumors. Interrogations mentioned gold. Whispers of Confederate funds moving south. But every story contradicted the last. Different routes, different destinations, different numbers. And that confusion worked perfectly. Because whether by accident or design, no single witness ever saw the whole picture. The convoy was leaving footprints in memory, not on maps. And with every mile, the legend of the Confederate treasure grew, even as the truth slipped further away. Among all the theories surrounding the Confederate treasure, one location appears again and again. Washington, Georgia. In April of 1865, this small southern town briefly became the last refuge of the Confederate leadership. Jefferson Davis himself passed through the area. For a moment, Washington was known as the place where the Confederacy took its final breath. According to local tradition, the treasure arrived here as well. The wagons rolled into town quietly. There were no announcements, no official records. Just tired men, nervous glances, and guards who never left their posts. At first, the plan may have been simple: rest, reorganize, then continue south. But something went wrong. Union forces were closer than expected. News traveled fast, and every hour increased the risk of capture. Worse still, trust among the Confederate officials began to crumble. Too many people knew they were there. Too many eyes were watching. That night, a decision was made. The treasure would not leave Washington. Some accounts claim it was divided among a small group of trusted men, each sent in a different direction to confuse pursuers. Others insist the gold was buried nearby, hidden hastily beneath the cover of darkness, marked only in memory. And then there are the darker versions. Stories of arguments. Raised voices. Men who did not leave town the next morning. Local legend speaks of shallow graves dug not for treasure, but for those who knew too much. By sunrise, the wagons were gone. No one saw them depart. No one heard them leave. They simply vanished. Union troops entered Washington soon after, and found nothing.
No gold, no wagons, no answers.
To this day, people in Washington, Georgia whisper that the treasure is still there, that it lies beneath old farmland, or under buildings constructed years later by people who never knew what rested below their feet. And if that's true, then one of the greatest fortunes of the Civil War may still be sleeping just beneath the soil. Not everyone believes the Confederate treasure was buried in the ground. Some believe it was never meant to be recovered at all. According to this theory, the convoy reached a river, perhaps the Savannah, perhaps the Chattahoochee, or another deep southern waterway whose name was deliberately forgotten. Rivers were perfect. They erased tracks. They swallowed evidence. And once something sank, it rarely came back. As Union forces closed in, the men guarding the treasure would have faced an impossible choice. If captured, the gold would be seized. If they tried to flee with it, The heavy wagons would slow them down. So they chose disappearance. Legend says the chests were rolled into the water one by one, iron bands pulling them down, mud closing over them, the river doing what it has always done, hiding the past beneath moving water. Some versions claim the wagons themselves were pushed in. Others say the gold was transferred into weighted crates to ensure it would never surface. And then the men walked away.
No markers. No maps.
No witnesses who could prove anything. Over the decades, divers and treasure hunters have searched these rivers. They've found relics of war, rusted weapons, broken wheels, fragments of camps. But gold? Never enough to confirm the legend. Rivers change. Currents shift. Silt piles up. What was once visible becomes unreachable. If the Confederate treasure lies beneath the water, it may be buried deeper today than it was in 1865. Hidden not by secrecy, but by time itself. After the war, life slowly returned to the South, at least on the surface. Fields were replanted. Towns rebuilt. Former Confederate officers faded back into civilian life. But for a small group of men, the war never truly ended. They were the ones who had been part of the final journey. Some of them were questioned by Union authorities. Others were approached privately, offered money, protection, even forgiveness in exchange for information about the missing treasure. They said nothing. A few made vague comments over the years. Half sentences. Careful words that revealed just enough to keep the mystery alive, but never enough to solve it. One former officer reportedly told a friend that the gold was safer where it lay than anywhere else. Another supposedly smiled when asked about it and replied that some secrets were worth more than gold itself. There were even rumors of deathbed confessions. Stories of old men, weak and fading, finally willing to speak, only to pass away before revealing anything concrete. Whether these confessions were real or invented later is impossible to say. What is certain is this: no verified map, letter, or detailed account ever surfaced. If the treasure was hidden by human hands, those hands went into the ground without passing on the full truth. And with every burial, the legend grew stronger. As the 19th century faded into history, the legend of the Confederate treasure refused to disappear with it. Instead, it evolved. In the early 1900s, local historians and amateur researchers began collecting old testimonies, faded letters, family stories passed down through generations. Each clue was incomplete, but together they formed a pattern, or at least the illusion of one. By the mid-20th century, treasure hunters arrived with shovels and metal detectors. They searched old farmland near Washington, Georgia. They followed riverbanks. They dug near abandoned roads and forgotten campsites. Every unusual signal from the ground sparked hope. Occasionally, something would be found. A single gold coin, a rusted lock, a broken piece of iron banding. Enough to fuel belief, but never enough to prove the legend. As technology improved, so did the searches. Ground-penetrating radar, advanced sonar, historical satellite analysis. The mystery attracted not just dreamers, but professionals. And then came the modern era. In 2018, reports surfaced that a group had discovered gold believed to be connected to the Confederate treasure. The location was sealed. Authorities stepped in. Details vanished from public view. No official confirmation was ever given. To some, this was proof that the treasure had finally been found and quietly taken. To others, it was just another chapter in a long history of disappointment. What mattered most was this: more than 150 years later, people were still searching. Not because the gold was guaranteed to exist, but because the story refused to die. With so many theories, searches, and decades of obsession, one question remains unavoidable. Why hasn't the Confederate treasure been found? One answer is time. More than a century and a half has passed since the wagons vanished. Forests have grown where roads once ran. Rivers have changed course. Towns have expanded, covering land that was once empty and forgotten. What could be seen in 1865 may be completely invisible today. Another answer is intention. If the treasure was hidden, it was hidden by men who understood pursuit, secrecy, and survival. They did not leave clear markers. They did not trust paper. They relied on memory, and memory dies with the man who carries it. And then there is the possibility that many don't like to consider. What if the treasure was never meant to be recovered? What if its final purpose was not to enrich anyone, but to vanish as a symbol of a lost cause. If the gold was divided, spent quietly, or absorbed into ordinary lives, it would leave no trail dramatic enough to follow. No single discovery. No moment of revelation. Just silence. Perhaps that is why the legend endures. Because the mystery isn't just about gold. It's about endings that never feel complete. Somewhere in the American South, history may still be holding its breath. Beneath roots that have grown undisturbed for generations. Under riverbeds that shift a little more each year. Or perhaps in no single place at all, scattered, forgotten, absorbed by time. The Confederate treasure has become more than gold. It is a reminder that not every story ends with an answer. That some chapters of history are deliberately closed, not by victory, but by silence. Men carried that treasure knowing they might never return. Knowing that if they succeeded, no one would ever know their names. And in a way, they succeeded perfectly. Because more than 150 years later, we are still asking the same question. What really happened to the Confederate gold? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real historical mysteries, lost treasures, and untold chapters of America's past, make sure to subscribe to the channel. New stories are coming, and the next one may be even closer to the truth. And now, I want to hear from you. Do you believe the Confederate treasure was buried somewhere near Washington, Georgia, sunk beneath a southern river, or quietly taken and spent, piece by piece, until it vanished forever? Which theory feels the most real to you, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments, because some mysteries live on, only as long as we keep talking about them.